You all didn't like that last video. Those I offended, I want to say that I'm sorry. To the loyal supporters of Jim Cornette, I feel like the blame is on me here. However, I believe there's been a miscommunication between us, and I think we should start over. That's why, in this very special video, I'm gonna explain to you why I believe Jim Cornette is a net negative for the world of modern wrestling. My name's Michael, welcome to Suplex. Before we begin, for those who don't know, Jim Cornette is a legendary figure in the world of pro wrestling. Known for his role as a manager, a promoter, a commentator, and most notably, his managing in 1980s Mid-South wrestling. Jim later became famous for his work in Jim Crockett Promotions and WCW. Yeah, that WCW, where he went on to manage such talented tag teams like the Midnight Express. His persona was a fast-talking, arrogant manager with a tennis racket and made him a very memorable villain of the time. In the 1990s, Cornette founded Smoky Mountain Wrestling, a regional wrestling promotion that gained a cult-like following and probably produced what I think is one of the funniest promos of all time.
Shout out to my homeboy, OJ Simpson. Keep up the good work, baby. 2 less we got to worry about.
After its closure, he worked for the WWF as an on-screen manager and a behind-the-scenes role in creative. Later, he would go on to TNA and Ring of Honor, contributing his expertise to those companies. Cornette is now mainly known for his podcasting. Cornette is known for his strong opinions on modern wrestling and has become a controversial figure in recent years due to his outspoken, often traditionalist views on the business. Despite the controversy, his influence on professional wrestling is undeniable, particularly for his contributions to tag team wrestling and his work as a manager. So before we dive into this, I want to say the things that Cornette has done in the pro wrestling business are tremendous, and no one can take those away from him. But his modern takes on wrestling are outdated, out of touch, and sometimes narrow-minded. Throughout history, there has always been the one person who has turned their nose up at the world changing around them. Whether it was people saying the Beatles are just a passing fad that no one will listen to in the next 2 years, or people saying that there's no way Netflix will ever replace Blockbuster, those people have existed throughout history. Pro wrestling is no different. Previous generations have always looked down on the new generation trying new things to evolve the art form. Now, I'm not sure when the first person did a vertical suplex, but I'm sure the old timers lost their mind about how fake it looked. I'm gonna pick this man up over my head and hold him for an extended period of time, then drop him down, and he's gonna stay completely straight up and vertical. I digress. Jim is that guy for this current generation. He lives up to that proud tradition of being a voice against progress. If we listened and valued these takes from the start, pro wrestling would never have become the phenomenon it is today. Look, nothing against George Hackenschmidt or Frank Gotch, but that type of wrestling would not work in the modern day. And while it's natural to feel nostalgic for the past, it's important to recognize the world is constantly evolving. The reason things can't go back to the way they were is because the context has changed. Social values, technology, and culture have all moved forward, and holding on to the past can sometimes limit potential for innovation, creativity, and a better future in general. Instead of reverting, we should honor what worked while staying open to new ideas and changes that reflect today's reality. If pro wrestling is going to continue to grow, it needs to change with the time. The 1980s were 40 years ago and they're not coming back. We have to live in that reality. No matter how many times we try to elect a celebrity president, and no matter how many new mullets I'm seeing, the 80s are not coming back. Appreciating the past is great, but we should not let that stand in the way of progress. Before moving on to my next point, I wanted to address several comments in my last video where I mentioned working for Jim in OVW. Look, here's a photo of me in my office when I was the director of OVW. Lying about working at OVW would be an incredibly weird thing to do. That's why I've chosen not to do that. Instead, I just work there, and I've told you about it. So there you go. And one of the other issues that I have about Jim is I feel like he's so disingenuous on his takes. Look, Jim has one of the largest podcasts in the pro wrestling space with over 400,000 subscribers on YouTube. Like it or not, Jim Cornette is a tastemaker in wrestling. So much so that you see people parroting Jim Cornette talking points and catchphrases, people using outlaw indie mud show non-ironically. I'm sorry, that's not how you talk. I know you don't talk like that. The only person who talks like that on the planet is Jim Cornette, and you're just parroting the stuff that that man is saying. And I believe Jim's takes are disingenuous. Watching the previous Jim Cornette podcast where he discusses the PWI 500, whenever there's a wrestler that Jim does not know, he seems to completely discount the work and effort that that person has done. Now, Jim, I would assume that most people who know about pro wrestling do not know about Jim Cornette. Now, Jim is a very popular podcaster, but this is a small space. It's pro wrestling. Pro wrestling nerds, most likely, like myself, know who Jim Cornette is. The average person does not. But that doesn't diminish the work and effort that Jim Cornette has put in over the years in pro wrestling. If that's something Jim Cornette would like extended to him, why doesn't he extend that to other people? In this day and age, not knowing about somebody is not an excuse. You have the internet. If you were in the pro wrestling space and somebody is on that PWI list, I don't know, the top 15 like Alex Kane was, and you don't know who it is, go out of your way. Go out of your way to Google them. By the way, go Google Alex Kane. He's MLW wrestler, hell of a wrestler. Go check him out. Instead of learning more about modern pro wrestling and using that to help shape and influence his fans, Jim will just crack a joke about the person's name or how he's never heard of them and who could they be if I've never heard of them. Jim, I don't know what to tell you, man. I just don't think that you like modern pro wrestling, and that's okay. If you don't like it, no one's forcing you to watch it. Now, I do understand that you probably make a good chunk of change off YouTube for down-talking modern pro wrestling, but you're not making the pro wrestling space any better. Jim, there's been so many complaints against you, but it seems like the cult of Cornette has always had your back, and it's always good to have those ride or die people, but I think it's a net negative for all of pro wrestling. The fact that we can't call somebody out like this without receiving backlash. And I'm not just talking about Jim Cornette. I'm now talking about the whole wrestling world. How many times have you been watching pro wrestling, trying to engage in the space of pro wrestling? You say something positive about WWE, and somebody comments, well, AEW is better. Or you're commenting about AEW and somebody writes, that's garbage, WWE is better. In pro wrestling, we have become so divided. And it's voices like Jim Cornette that continue to divide us further. I am never trying to take away what Jim had done in the pro wrestling space. Good for him. He made a name for himself, and that name has carried him to still be a tastemaker in wrestling. But Jim seems to have not a lot of good modern taste or takes. Look, if it's not for you, step away from it. And that's okay, because the 1980s are never coming back. People have to realize that we are always going to keep pushing the art form further. Look, and I say that now as a fan of modern wrestling. Now, I hope that I do not find myself in the same shoes that Jim did in 20, 30 years where they're wrestling with anti-grav boots, and I'm saying, back in my day, they actually had to hit the ropes. The ropes weren't automatic. And you know what? Maybe I will be the old man yelling at the clouds one day, but I hope not. And I really hope, for the sake of wrestling, the people who listen to Jim Cornette and find him amusing take it with a little grain of salt, because the man is really, really in love with a certain type of wrestling. And that's okay. But all that wrestling is probably already done. Speaking of done, so is this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I mean this. If there is any big Jim Cornette fans, cult of Cornette fans, if you've made it this far in the video, I want to say thank you. And I mean this. Like, take away like the whatever, and let me just be real with you for a minute. I appreciate you challenging your worldview. Sometimes there are people who are going to click on this video, realize that I'm talking poorly about Jim Cornette, they'll comment something, and then they'll bail, right? That's fine. But if you've made it here, you're willing to challenge some of the things that you know about wrestling, and I appreciate that. So I just want to say thank you. All right, folks, remember, pro wrestling is predetermined, and your life isn't. Go do something great today. See you next time.